Around 3,600 years ago, an island in the Aegean Sea ceased to exist. Not slowly, not gradually. In a matter of hours, one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in all of human history tore the island of Thera apart from the inside, ejected between 30 and 60 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the sky, and sent tsunamis racing across the Aegean at the speed of a jet aircraft. To understand the scale, the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883 is still considered one of the most catastrophic volcanic events in recorded history. It killed tens of thousands of people, darkened skies halfway around the world, and sent a sound wave that circled the planet multiple times. The eruption of Thera was 4 to 5 times more powerful. The ash cloud reached Egypt. The tsunamis struck coastlines across the eastern Mediterranean, and the island itself, which had been home to one of the most sophisticated cities of the Bronze Age, was swallowed by the sea when the volcano's chamber emptied and the ground above it collapsed. What remained was a wound in the ocean, a deep, flooded caldera surrounded by cliff walls of solidified ash. The island of Santorini that exists today is what was left standing around the edges after the center fell in, and 70 miles to the south, close enough to see the ash cloud on the horizon, lay the heart of Europe's first great civilization, the Minoans. Their ships dominated the Mediterranean. Their city had indoor plumbing in 1600 BC. Europe would not see its equal for 2,000 years. Their artists painted dolphins and ships and ceremonies across walls that still survive today. All of these nearly 3,000 years before the Roman Empire. They created a writing system that more than 3,000 years later, no one on Earth has been able to decipher. Then one morning, the island beneath their feet cracked open. The eruption that followed was so powerful that Greenland's ice still carries its chemical fingerprint. Irish oak trees from more than 2,000 miles away recorded the climate shock in their growth rings. Within generations of that eruption, their world was gone. This is the story of how it ended and how much of it we will never fully understand. If this is the kind of story you want more of, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps bring more stories like this one to more people. And if you would be so kind, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from today and what time is it there? I read all your comments, and it always amazes me to see people listening to these stories from all over the world. Now let's go back to that island before the earthquake started. Across the blue waters of the Aegean Sea, islands rise and fall in long chains, forming stepping stones between mainland Europe, Anatolia, and the eastern Mediterranean. Near the southern edge rests Crete, the largest Greek island, covering about 3,200 square miles. North of it lies the scattered Cyclades archipelago, where smaller islands catch the winds and currents that have carried travelers for thousands of years. Among those islands sat Thera, a volcanic outpost, whose place on the map would shape the history of an entire region. During the Bronze Age, stretching from about 3100 before Christ until 1200 before Christ, the eastern Mediterranean became a tapestry of growing civilizations. Communities learned to organize cities, record information through writing, establish legal traditions for trade, and shape increasingly complex systems of government. Copper and tin traveled by sea to become bronze, while pottery, textiles, oils, and precious goods crossed the same routes. Far from being isolated cultures, these societies formed an interconnected world where ideas moved almost as freely as cargo. Within this network lived the people now known as the Minoans. They are often grouped beside the later civilizations of Greece, yet they belong to a different story altogether. Their language cannot be linked to Greek Their customs followed their own path, and their artistic traditions developed independently. More than 1,000 years separated them from the classical age that would later fill history books with familiar names. Their world stood on its own foundations, shaped by the sea surrounding Crete. Even the name by which they are remembered came long after their civilization disappeared. In the early 20th century, British archaeologist Arthur Evans began uncovering remarkable remains on Crete. Believing the discoveries echoed the legends of King Minos, he introduced the name Minoan. Whatever these people once called themselves has faded beyond recovery, leaving only the label created by modern archaeology. Evidence of their earliest communities appears around 3100 before Christ. Across the following centuries, villages expanded into organized settlements, and remarkable engineering began to emerge. By about 2000 before Christ, large multi-story palace complexes already stood above the landscape. These buildings reflected careful planning and generations of accumulated knowledge, suggesting a civilization that had matured through steady development instead of sudden transformation. Its greatest flourishing arrived between about 1700 and 1600 before Christ, during what archaeologists call the New Palace period. At Knossos, the largest urban center on Crete, perhaps 20,000 to 25,000 people lived and worked together. Few places anywhere on Earth matched that scale at the time. The city became a center where administration, craftsmanship, religion, and commerce blended into one living community. About 68 miles north of Crete rested Thera, covering only about 11 square miles. Though modest in size, its location placed it directly along important maritime routes, connecting the islands with Egypt, Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Greek mainland. Ships entering or leaving the southern Aegean naturally passed nearby, making the island an ideal place for exchange and communication. On Thera's southern coast stood Akrotiri, a thriving settlement whose streets, homes, and workshops formed one of the brightest expressions of the Minoan world. When the soil of Crete began giving up its secrets in 1900, the picture of Europe's earliest past changed almost overnight. British archaeologist Arthur Evans started excavating on the island's northern coast, expecting traces of an early settlement. Layer after layer revealed something much greater, a sprawling palace unlike anything scholars believed had existed so early in European history. Instead of scattered ruins from a modest community, an entire administrative heart emerged from the earth, carrying evidence of a civilization whose achievements had rested unnoticed for thousands of years. The palace at Knossos covered more than 215,000 square feet. Rooms unfolded into open courtyards, broad staircases connected several stories, and long rows of storage chambers stretched through the complex. Stone columns framed gathering places, where ceremonies and public life likely unfolded. Deep within stood a throne room that still preserves much of its original arrangement, offering one of the clearest surviving spaces from the Bronze Age. Every corridor suggested careful planning, with architecture designed for movement, ceremony, and daily administration rather than display alone. This was far more than the residence of a ruler. Knossos functioned as the political center where decisions shaped the island, the religious center where rituals united communities, and the economic center where goods arriving from farms and distant ports were collected, measured, stored, and redistributed. Workshops filled with skilled craftspeople likely surrounded these official spaces, producing pottery, textiles, carved objects, and painted works that reflected shared traditions. Government, belief, commerce, and artistic expression all occupied the same living structure, woven together into a single institution. Its engineering reveals another layer of remarkable knowledge. Clay pipes ran beneath floors and through walls, carrying fresh water while directing wastewater away from occupied rooms. Some sections narrowed deliberately, increasing water pressure through carefully shaped channels. Such details show practical understanding refined across many generations. Hydraulic systems of comparable sophistication would not become familiar across Europe until much later, making Knossos one of the earliest known examples of advanced water management on the continent. Movement across Crete also reflected thoughtful organization. Archaeological evidence points to paved roads connecting Knossos with neighboring settlements, creating dependable routes for merchants, officials, travelers, and agricultural supplies. These roads formed what many researchers recognize as Europe's earliest planned road network. Instead of isolated communities separated by difficult terrain, the island functioned through carefully maintained connections that strengthened trade and communication. The walls themselves became records of everyday imagination. Brilliant blues, rich reds, warm ochres, and crisp white backgrounds framed dolphins swimming across painted seas, lilies opening beneath bright skies, graceful processions of elaborately dressed figures, and scenes of astonishing athletic skill. Among the most celebrated are the bull leaping frescoes, where agile performers grasp the horns of charging bulls before vaulting across powerful backs in carefully choreographed ritual displays. These paintings capture movement with confidence, preserving moments that still appear full of life. The bull occupied a central place in Minoan belief and symbolism. Its presence echoes through sculptures, ceremonial objects, and painted walls. Later Greek traditions transformed these memories into stories of the labyrinth and the Minotaur, perhaps inspired by the winding passages of Knossos and rituals that once centered upon these formidable animals. The palace itself endured repeated destruction through earthquakes and rebuilding across generations. Each reconstruction expanded its scale and ambition, revealing a society that answered hardship with renewed craftsmanship, preserving continuity through persistence instead of retreat. A civilization often reveals its character through what it chooses to build, preserve, and celebrate. In the case of the Minoans, the archaeological record offers an unusual portrait. Across the major palace centers of Crete, towering defensive walls are largely absent. Massive fortifications, so common among neighboring powers, do not dominate the landscape. Excavations have uncovered weapons, though not in the enormous quantities usually associated with kingdoms built upon conquest. The evidence suggests a society that invested its greatest energy elsewhere. Its strength rested upon the surrounding sea. Fleets of ships connected Crete with distant shores, carrying merchants, craftspeople, diplomats, and ideas across the eastern Mediterranean. Control of these maritime routes brought influence that did not depend upon expanding borders through constant warfare. Harbors became gateways where wealth arrived with the tides, allowing prosperity to circulate throughout the island. Security appears to have come from command of important shipping lanes and the confidence that skilled sailors could protect the routes linking distant communities. Trade carried far more than practical goods. Minoan pottery has been recovered from archaeological sites in Egypt, the Levant, Cyprus, Anatolia, and mainland Greece. At the same time, objects crafted in Egypt reached Cretan settlements, demonstrating regular contact between remarkable civilizations separated by open water. Copper, tin, fine, stone, ivory, oils, textiles, and luxury items traveled alongside stories, artistic traditions, and religious ideas. Every successful voyage strengthened relationships extending across hundreds of miles, weaving Crete into one of the earliest international trading networks. The objects fashioned by Minoan artisans display extraordinary confidence and refinement. Potters covered graceful vessels with dark polished surfaces before decorating them with flowing marine designs. Octopuses stretched curling arms around rounded jars. Sea urchins, nautiluses, shells, fish, and drifting sea plants wrapped naturally across the clay, giving the impression that the ocean itself had settled onto each surface. These were not rigid geometric patterns copied by habit. They reflected close observation of living waters that shaped everyday experience. Human figures appear with equal care. Women occupy central places within frescoes, ceremonial processions, and religious scenes. They stand prominently instead of remaining at the edges, wearing elaborate garments and participating in rituals that seem to carry considerable importance. Many scholars interpret this recurring imagery as evidence that female religious leaders guided important ceremonies within a belief system centered upon powerful goddesses. Among the most recognizable discoveries are the snake goddess figurines, portraying a composed woman holding serpents in outstretched hands, an image that has become one of the defining symbols of the Bronze Age. Children also appear in surprising ways. Painted walls show young figures boxing in organized contests, gathering saffron flowers across rocky fields, and taking part in activities that suggest learning, celebration, and shared community life. Such scenes imply a society possessing enough agricultural surplus and social stability to imagine childhood as more than constant labor. Leisure, ritual, and education found a place beside work, leaving an unusually human record of daily existence. Their written language remains one of archaeology's greatest unanswered puzzles. A script known as Linear A developed from an even earlier writing tradition called Cretan hieroglyphic. Scribes impressed its characters onto clay tablets that probably recorded harvests, stored goods, and commercial exchanges. Despite more than a century of determined study, no one has successfully deciphered the language beneath those symbols. The Minoans therefore remain Europe's only major early civilization whose surviving words cannot yet be understood, leaving their voices present in form, yet still beyond our reach. Set upon the southern coast of Thera, Akrotiri occupied far more than a convenient harbor. For its own age, it ranked among the most sophisticated urban centers anywhere in the Mediterranean. Streets followed an organized plan, crossing one another with purpose instead of growing at random. Stone buildings rose 3 and sometimes 4 stories above the ground, surrounding open squares where daily commerce and community life unfolded. Workshops filled the lower levels, while families lived above them, creating neighborhoods where craft and domestic life existed side by side. The city's infrastructure matched its carefully arranged streets. Clay pipes carried wastewater through walls and beneath roadways, directing it away from homes with remarkable efficiency. Rainwater drainage and household sanitation formed part of the original design instead of being added later. Comparable urban engineering would not appear elsewhere in Europe until the rise of Roman construction, roughly 1,500 years afterward. Such planning reveals generations of accumulated practical knowledge, refined long before later civilizations became celebrated for similar achievements. Volcanic ash, though responsible for overwhelming the settlement, became its unlikely guardian. Buildings remained standing beneath deep layers of pumice and debris, protected from weather, erosion, and later construction. Walls survived almost to their original height in several districts, preserving staircases, doorways, windows, and interior rooms with exceptional clarity. Few Bronze Age cities anywhere on Earth have endured with such completeness, allowing archaeologists to move through streets that still retain much of their original form. One absence proved just as revealing as everything preserved. Excavators expected to uncover stores of gold, silver, and personal jewelry inside prosperous homes. Almost none appeared. Valuable possessions had vanished before the eruption reached its final violence. The most convincing explanation points toward repeated earthquakes that likely disturbed the island beforehand, providing enough warning for residents to gather treasured belongings and depart. Their escape transformed the archaeological record into evidence of careful preparation instead of sudden panic. The objects left behind create an intimate portrait of interrupted routine. Large ceramic jars remained where they had been stored, some still holding traces of wine, olive oil, and preserved fish. Looms stood inside workshops with threads still attached, waiting for hands that never returned. Household vessels rested on shelves, tools remained beside unfinished tasks, and storage rooms stayed orderly. Every room suggests ordinary life, paused during familiar work, then remained untouched beneath volcanic deposits for thousands of years. For decades, archaeologists found no human victims at all. This remarkable absence strengthened the idea that much of the population escaped before disaster struck. Then, in 1999, excavators uncovered a single skeleton beneath collapsed masonry. That individual remains the only confirmed casualty discovered within the city itself. A solitary reminder that evacuation, however successful, was not absolutely complete. The painted walls of Akrotiri preserve another extraordinary archive. Because frescoes were applied directly onto fresh plaster before burial, their colors remain strikingly vivid. The Fleet fresco from the West House stretches across an entire room, portraying ships traveling between coastal settlements while dolphins swim beside them and people gather along the shore. It stands as the oldest known narrative seascape in European history. Other paintings broaden the picture of Minoan life. The saffron gatherers depict young women collecting delicate crimson flower stamens prized as spice, medicine, and dye. Nearby, the blue monkeys climb across rocky landscapes despite no such primates living naturally on Thera. Their appearance points toward familiarity with lands farther south, perhaps through contact with Egypt, where African monkeys were well known. These walls preserve more than artistic skill. They preserve the reach of a civilization whose imagination extended far beyond the horizon surrounding its island home. Stone, clay, and painted plaster preserve countless traces of Minoan belief, yet their deepest meanings remain beyond modern understanding. Archaeologists can identify places of worship, ceremonial objects, and repeated religious symbols with remarkable confidence. The spoken words accompanying those rituals, however, have vanished behind an undeciphered language. Their prayers, hymns, and sacred stories survive only through the actions they left behind, allowing each discovery to illuminate practice while leaving belief itself partly concealed. Across Crete and the neighboring islands, many sacred places occupied the highest ground. These peak sanctuaries overlooked valleys, coastlines, and distant mountains, connecting worship with expansive views of the surrounding world. Excavations have uncovered fire pits, small clay figurines representing people and animals, drinking vessels, and evidence that groups gathered there for shared ceremonial meals. Climbing toward these summits appears to have formed part of religious experience itself, placing participants within landscapes that stretched from fertile plains to the open sea. Other sacred spaces reached in the opposite direction, descending into the earth instead of rising above it. Caves across Crete received offerings for centuries, becoming places where natural darkness and echoing chambers shaped acts of devotion, Among the most celebrated is the Idaean cave. Greek tradition later identified it as the birthplace of Zeus, yet Minoan artifacts discovered inside are centuries older than those familiar legends. The cave already possessed sacred importance long before Greek mythology attached new stories to its depths. One symbol appears with striking consistency wherever Minoan religious life is found. The double axe, known as the labries, decorates walls, ceremonial vessels, carved stones, and ritual objects throughout Crete. Despite its widespread presence, its precise meaning remains unknown. It may have represented divine authority, renewal, sacrifice, or another concept no surviving text can explain. Whatever significance it carried, the repeated appearance of the labries across nearly every major site suggests that it occupied a central place within Minoan cosmology. The bull held equally profound importance. Painted scenes showing acrobats vaulting over charging animals almost certainly portray ritual performances instead of athletic entertainment alone. The immense strength of the bull, its unpredictable power, and its commanding presence made it one of the civilization's defining sacred images. Sculptures, ceremonial horns, seals, and painted walls all repeat the same creature, weaving it into religious identity. Centuries later, memories of these traditions would reappear within Greek stories describing the Minotaur and the legendary King Minos, transformed through generations of retelling. Some archaeological discoveries introduce more difficult possibilities. At the sanctuary of Animospilia near Knossos, excavators uncovered the remains of three individuals preserved beneath a collapsed roof. One young man appeared positioned upon a raised platform with a bronze knife resting nearby, while two others lay close at hand. The surrounding evidence has led several scholars to propose that a ritual involving human sacrifice may have been interrupted when an earthquake brought the building down. Other researchers interpret the remains differently, arguing that certainty remains impossible because the evidence can support more than one explanation. Even so, the timing invites careful reflection. Geological evidence indicates that earthquakes disturbed the region before the great eruption of Thera. Some scholars suggest that unusual ceremonies may have arisen in response to those unsettling tremors as communities searched for reassurance within familiar traditions. Later Greek mythology gathered many echoes from this older world. Tales of Minos, the labyrinth, the Minotaur, and Europa carried fragments of beliefs whose original meanings had already begun to fade, preserving distant reflections of a civilization whose sacred language still waits to be understood. No landscape remains unchanged forever, especially one built above the restless boundary of Earth's shifting crust. Long before the famous catastrophe entered human memory, Thera had already lived through repeated cycles of creation and collapse. It was not a single volcanic cone standing alone. It belonged to a caldera system, a structure formed when immense eruptions emptied underground reservoirs of molten rock until the land above sank inward. Across roughly 360,000 years, this cycle of growth, destruction, renewal, and rebuilding repeated at least 12 times, each event reshaping the island into another version of itself. After every collapse, fresh magma gradually rose from deep below, collecting once again inside an expanding chamber beneath the surface. Layer upon layer of volcanic rock accumulated over countless generations, rebuilding slopes that appeared permanent to anyone living upon them. The island that supported prosperous settlements represented only one stage in an ongoing geological rhythm. Human lives unfolded across decades, while the volcano measured its own history across spans so long that entire civilizations could rise without witnessing a complete cycle. The forces gathering beneath Thera did not appear all at once. Geological evidence indicates that magma had been accumulating for centuries before the Great Bronze Age eruption. As pressure increased, the island likely offered subtle signals that something was changing. Minor earthquakes disturbed the ground from time to time. Cracks opened in places where none had existed before. Vapors carrying the scent of sulfur occasionally drifted upward through vents, while parts of the landscape slowly shifted as hidden chambers expanded beneath them. Those signs probably became more frequent during the months, or perhaps even years, leading toward the final eruption. Repeated tremors would have unsettled homes, damaged walls, and reminded every resident that the earth beneath their feet remained active. Archaeological evidence from Akrotiri supports this gradual progression. Buildings show indications of earthquake damage that occurred before volcanic ash buried the city. The absence of widespread human remains and valuable possessions suggests that many inhabitants recognized the growing danger and departed, while escape remained possible. The source of this activity lies deep beneath the eastern Mediterranean. Thera forms part of the Hellenic Arc, a long volcanic region created where the African tectonic plate slowly descends beneath the Eurasian plate. As one enormous slab of Earth's crust sinks into the mantle, heat and pressure generate magma that eventually rises toward the surface. This same tectonic system also feeds famous volcanoes elsewhere in the region, including Vesuvius, Stromboli, and the volcanoes of the Aeolian Islands. Although separated by sea and distance, they belong to the same immense geological engine. The chamber hidden beneath Thera reached extraordinary dimensions before the eruption. Geological estimates suggest it contained somewhere between about 7 and 14 cubic miles of magma. Such a volume represented an immense store of energy waiting beneath an island that seemed stable from above. For centuries, pressure continued increasing as molten rock accumulated within confined spaces below the surface. Modern volcanologists classify the Minoan eruption as a 7 on the 8-point volcanic explosivity index, placing it among the largest eruptions experienced during human civilization. That rating places it alongside the eruption of Tambora in 1815, the event that produced the year without a summer and contributed to widespread crop failures and famine across parts of Europe and North America. Some current studies even suggest that Thera may have exceeded Tambora in total eruptive power. By comparison, Krakatoa reached level 6 in 1883, generated a devastating tsunami, claimed about 36,000 lives, and altered skies around the world for years. Thera was likely between 4 and 10 times more powerful. Geologists no longer see the great eruption of Thera as a single overwhelming blast. The layers preserved across the island and beneath the surrounding sea tell a more intricate story, one written in stacked bands of pumice, ash, and shattered volcanic rock. Each layer records a separate chapter within the same catastrophe. For clarity, researchers identify these stages as Minoan A through Minoan D, revealing a sequence that unfolded through changing conditions instead of one uninterrupted explosion. The first stage, known as Minoan A, began with a towering Plinian eruption column that rose roughly 22 to 25 miles into the stratosphere. Ash, pumice, and volcanic fragments poured upward before drifting back across Thera and neighboring waters. Akrotiri disappeared beneath thick blankets of lightweight pumice that steadily filled streets, courtyards, and rooftops. Curiously, this first deposit helped preserve much of the city's architecture. Buildings remained standing beneath accumulating layers instead of being immediately torn apart, creating the remarkable archaeological record uncovered thousands of years later. As the eruption continued, the towering column became increasingly unstable. During the second stage, called Minoan B, sections of that immense plume collapsed under their own weight. Dense currents of scorching gas, volcanic ash, and pulverized rock rushed outward across the landscape at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. These pyroclastic surges flowed close to the ground, following valleys and low terrain while carrying temperatures capable of destroying nearly every living thing in their path. Whatever structures or vegetation still remained exposed after the opening phase would have faced forces impossible to withstand. The third stage, identified as Minoan C, brought further pyroclastic activity together with profound structural changes beneath the volcano itself. Deep underground, the expanding void left by departing magma weakened the support holding the island together. Sections of the volcanic system began collapsing inward, altering the shape of the land from below. As enormous masses of rock shifted and descended, seawater responded violently. Many researchers conclude that the earliest tsunami waves probably formed during this stage, generated when collapsing portions of the volcanic structure displaced tremendous volumes of water. The final phase, Minoan D, completed the transformation. The roof of the magma chamber gave way on a massive scale, allowing the central portion of the island to plunge downward. Water surged into the newly formed depression as surrounding land fractured into separate sections. This collapse generated the largest tsunami associated with the eruption, sending immense waves racing across the Aegean Sea. A landmass that had once formed an almost continuous circle became a broken ring surrounding a flooded caldera, permanently altering the geography of the region. Exactly how long the entire eruption lasted remains uncertain. Some volcanologists argue that the sequence unfolded within several hours of extraordinary intensity. Others believe pauses separated individual phases, extending the disaster across several days or perhaps even weeks. The geological evidence supports more than one interpretation, leaving the precise timeline open to continuing investigation. The quantity of material expelled remains equally astonishing. Conservative estimates suggest that at least about 7 cubic miles of volcanic debris entered the atmosphere, while higher estimates approach roughly 14 cubic miles. The ash cloud likely rose high enough to become visible from Egypt, mainland Greece, and parts of Anatolia, spreading across enormous distances and dimming daylight beneath its expanding canopy. The landscape left behind became the foundation of modern Santorini. Towering cliffs now curve around a broad water-filled caldera about 7.5 miles across. White buildings perched above those volcanic walls overlook a scene shaped by absence as much as presence, the enduring outline of a vanished island whose center collapsed into the sea. After the mountain gave way, the sea inherited the force that stone could no longer contain. The collapse of Thera's volcanic center displaced an immense volume of water, producing waves that geologists classify as megatsunamis. These differed from ordinary tsunami events in both origin and scale. Instead of a simple disturbance traveling across the surface, the sudden descent of part of an island into a newly forming caldera transferred extraordinary energy into the surrounding sea, sending walls of water racing outward in every direction. Computer models and geological studies produce varying estimates for the height of those waves. Some reconstructions suggest they reached nearly 100 feet near parts of the Aegean, while others indicate towering walls exceeding 300 feet under certain conditions. Along nearby coastlines, survival would have depended upon distance, elevation, and chance. Harbors, beaches, and low settlements stood directly in the path of forces unlike anything normally witnessed along the Mediterranean shoreline. Far from shore, tsunami waves behave differently from ordinary breakers. They travel as long, powerful pulses that move through deep water with astonishing speed while remaining difficult to detect from the decks of ships. The waves generated by Thera may have crossed the open Aegean at roughly 500 miles per hour, approaching the cruising speed of a modern passenger aircraft. Crete, only about 68 miles from the volcano, would have received the first waves within a remarkably short span after the caldera collapsed. Archaeology preserves the sea's passage as clearly as volcanic ash preserves the eruption itself. At Palacastro, on the eastern coast of Crete, researchers uncovered layers containing marine sand, pumice, broken pottery, and other debris deposited together during the late Minoan period. The mixture differs completely from ordinary coastal sediments, recording a single, overwhelming marine event that swept inland before retreating. Nature compressed that brief moment into a layer that remained recognizable across more than 3,600 years. Similar evidence appears farther west along the northern coast of Crete at Malea. Beneath later Minoan construction lies another distinctive tsunami deposit, marking the inland reach of powerful seawater carrying sand, volcanic material, and fragments of human activity. Builders eventually returned and raised new structures above it, yet the buried layer continued, preserving the unmistakable signature of one extraordinary day. The reach of these waves extended beyond Crete. During 2021, archaeologists investigating the site of Sesme Baglararisi on the western coast of Anatolia identified tsunami deposits containing volcanic ash, structural debris, and human skeletal remains. The discovery demonstrated that the effects of Thera crossed the eastern Aegean, leaving physical evidence far beyond the volcano itself. Geological fingerprints connected distant shorelines through the same catastrophic event. The destruction reached beyond immediate loss of life. Minoan influence depended upon harbors, docks, shipyards, warehouses, and fleets that linked islands with distant ports. Megatsunamis shattered this maritime foundation. Vessels were smashed or carried inland. Storage facilities disappeared beneath water and debris, and carefully built coastal infrastructure vanished within minutes. Even surviving communities faced the immense challenge of rebuilding the physical network that had supported trade across the sea. Floating pumice created another obstacle after the waves had passed. Great rafts of lightweight volcanic stone drifted across the eastern Mediterranean, collecting into broad fields that interfered with navigation for many months. Mariners encountering these floating barriers entered waters transformed almost beyond recognition. Fragments of wreckage, drifting pumice, and the stories carried by survivors gradually spread news of the disaster from one coastline to another, embedding the memory of Thera within the shared experience of the ancient Mediterranean. The eruption did not end where the volcano stood. Once the first towering column reached the upper atmosphere, winds assumed control of the material it carried. Fine ash and lightweight pumice drifted far beyond the broken island, spreading across sea and land with little regard for coastlines or political boundaries. Every layer preserved in sediment today marks another point along the expanding footprint of one extraordinary event. Prevailing winds during the opening phase carried much of the ash toward the southeast. The cloud crossed the lower Aegean, passed over the Dodecanese Islands, and continued toward the eastern Mediterranean. Beneath those moving skies, countless particles settled through the air onto forests, fields, villages, and open water. Many grains were scarcely larger than dust, Yet together they formed a geological horizon that researchers can still trace thousands of years later. The seabed preserves this history with remarkable clarity. Sediment cores collected from many parts of the Aegean contain a distinctive layer of Theran volcanic material separating older deposits from younger ones. In certain underwater basins, accumulated ash and pumice eventually reached thicknesses ranging from about 33 feet to more than 260 feet. Those deposits reveal that the sea itself became one of the largest archives of the eruption, steadily recording each stage as particles drifted downward through the water column. Nearby islands experienced even greater accumulation. On Anaphi, lying immediately east of Thera, pumice buried the landscape beneath roughly 7 feet of material. Roads received volcanic ash approaching 3 feet in some areas, while Kos accumulated about 1 foot. Such deposits transformed familiar terrain almost overnight, covering vegetation, filling depressions, and altering coastlines beneath blankets of fresh volcanic debris. The eruption extended far beyond the islands closest to its source. Scientists have identified Theran ash within the Nile Delta, approximately 560 miles from the volcano, confirming that the cloud reached northern Africa. Matching volcanic material also appears in lake sediments from western Anatolia, within ancient deposits near Gaza, and inside stratigraphic layers preserved across parts of Israel. Each discovery enlarges the known reach of the eruption, connecting distant landscapes through a shared layer of microscopic volcanic fragments. Crete experienced a more uneven pattern. Much of the western portion shows relatively little evidence for substantial ash accumulation. Conditions differed greatly along the northeastern coastline, where communities faced directly toward the volcano. At Palicastro, archaeologists have documented roughly 6 inches of ash and pumice associated with the eruption. Although that depth may appear modest beside the towering deposits found nearer Thera, its consequences for farming proved far more significant than the measurement alone might suggest. Fresh volcanic ash contains sharp mineral particles and chemically reactive material capable of disrupting agriculture. Fields buried beneath even a shallow layer struggled to support crops. Grazing animals encountered contaminated vegetation and water, while streams and reservoirs collected suspended volcanic sediment. Harvest declined across affected districts, and recovery demanded repeated seasons before soils gradually regained fertility through weathering and biological activity. The atmosphere carried additional consequences beyond the visible deposits on the ground. Fine ash, suspended high above the eastern Mediterranean, reduced incoming sunlight for extended periods, diminishing the energy available for growing plants across regions that received little direct fallout. Agricultural calendars became increasingly difficult to sustain as light levels fluctuated beneath lingering volcanic haze. Taken together, these effects reveal an event that reached well beyond the shores surrounding Thera. Trade routes, harvests, settlements, and coastal societies throughout the eastern Mediterranean entered the same expanding sphere of disruption, linked by a drifting cloud that settled across an entire interconnected world. The influence of a great eruption can extend far beyond the horizon that witnessed it. When a volcanic column rises into the stratosphere, enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide may remain suspended high above the weather for months or even years. Those particles reflect part of the sun's energy back into space, allowing less warmth to reach Earth's surface. The eruption of Tambora in 1815 demonstrated this process with remarkable clarity, lowering average global temperatures by about 1 degree Fahrenheit and contributing to failed harvests across much of the northern hemisphere. Whether Thera produced a comparable volcanic winter has remained one of the most enduring questions in Bronze Age research. The eruption clearly transformed the eastern Mediterranean, yet determining its broader climatic influence has proven far more difficult. Volcanic deposits can often be identified with confidence near their source, while subtle atmospheric effects become increasingly difficult to separate from the countless natural variations recorded across distant continents. One of the earliest clues appeared in Ireland. British dendrochronologist Mike Bailey identified unusually narrow growth rings preserved within ancient bog oak trees dating to roughly 1628 before the Common Era. Such restricted growth commonly reflects a growing season marked by reduced sunlight or lower temperatures. For many years, these trees seemed to provide compelling evidence that the eruption of Thera had disrupted climate far beyond the Aegean, leaving its signature within forests, separated from the volcano by hundreds of miles. Evidence from western North America appeared to strengthen that interpretation. Ancient bristlecone pine trees growing among the mountains of California preserved distinctive frost rings dating to approximately the same period. These scars form when freezing conditions interrupt growth during what should be the warmest part of the year. Together, the Irish oaks and California pines seem to describe an unusually cold interval that many researchers connected directly to the Minoan eruption. Scientific understanding changed as new methods became available. During 2022, Charlotte Pearson and colleagues at the University of Arizona compared chemical signatures preserved within ice cores collected from Greenland and Antarctica. Their analysis concluded that the climatic disturbance recorded around 1628 before the Common Era matched another eruption altogether, one originating from Mount Aniakchak in Alaska. The famous tree ring anomalies, once widely attributed to Thera, almost certainly reflected that distant northern volcano instead. That discovery did not erase Thera from the climate record. It simply showed that one influential piece of evidence belonged elsewhere. Researchers continue searching for signals that may correspond more closely with the Aegean eruption. The atmospheric effects could have occurred during a different year, varied in regional intensity, or blended with natural climate fluctuations in ways that remain difficult to distinguish after more than 3,000 years. Ancient written traditions add another layer of possibility, though certainty remains elusive. Chinese historical records, known as the Bamboo Annals, describe yellow fog, a dimmed sun, the appearance of three suns, frost during midsummer, famine, and widespread crop failure around the decline of the Xia dynasty. Some scholars have wondered whether these descriptions preserve distant memories of atmospheric disturbances following a major volcanic eruption. Others caution that the events may reflect another eruption entirely or different natural phenomena. Egypt presents a similar puzzle. A literary composition called The Admonitions of Ipuwer describes rivers appearing red, darkness across the land, failed harvests, and social disorder. Some researchers have linked these images to environmental disruption following the eruption of Thera, perhaps through ash reaching the Nile Delta, altered waterways, or disturbances along the coast. No surviving Egyptian inscription directly records the eruption itself, leaving these echoes suspended between historical possibility and enduring mystery. Some mysteries survive not because evidence is absent, but because the evidence refuses to agree with itself. The eruption of Thera occupies exactly such a place within ancient history. After more than a century of investigation, no universally accepted calendar date has emerged. Few events from the Bronze Age have received such careful study while continuing to resist a single answer. The disagreement reaches far beyond the volcano itself. touching the chronology of civilizations spread across the eastern Mediterranean. Two independent methods stand at the center of this debate, each supported by decades of careful research. Archaeological chronology relies upon the sequence of cultural remains left by human societies. Radiocarbon dating measures the gradual decay of carbon 14 preserved within once living material. Ordinarily, these approaches reinforce one another. At Thera, they point toward different centuries, separated by roughly 100 to 150 years. Neither explanation has fully displaced the other, leaving researchers with two carefully constructed timelines that cannot yet be reconciled. The traditional archaeological date developed through comparisons linking Crete, the Aegean Islands, and Egypt, pottery styles, imported goods, artistic influences, and trade connections create a framework that aligns the eruption with the late Minoan period and the 18th dynasty of Egypt. Following this approach, many archaeologists have placed the catastrophe at approximately 1500 before the Common Era. Within that historical structure, the volcanic disaster becomes part of a broader sequence already established through Egyptian royal chronology and Mediterranean exchange. Radiocarbon evidence presents another picture. Organic remains recovered from eruption deposits at Akrotiri have repeatedly produced older dates. Seeds, charred wood, and perhaps most famously, an olive branch buried within pumice shortly before the eruption, have all yielded results, clustering between about 1650 and 1600 before the Common Era, with some analyses extending even earlier. Improvements in radiocarbon calibration have refined these estimates rather than eliminating them. During 2022, researchers applying the updated International Calibration 20 dataset concluded that the eruption most likely occurred between 1606 and 1589 before the Common Era within the highest statistical confidence range. The consequences of accepting that earlier chronology extend well beyond one volcanic island. A shift of roughly 100 years would require historians to reconsider relationships among many Bronze Age cultures. Timelines describing Egyptian rulers, the emergence of Mycenaean influence, trade throughout the Levant, and the expansion of the Hittite kingdom all depend upon carefully connected chronological frameworks. Altering one major reference point inevitably affects many others, much like adjusting a single gear within an intricate mechanical clock. For that reason, the disagreement cannot be dismissed as a technical detail relevant only to specialists. Chronology forms the foundation upon which historical interpretation rests. Every exchange of goods, every diplomatic relationship, and every sequence of cultural development depends upon knowing which events came before others. When the date of Thera shifts, the order of many surrounding events may shift with it. Recent investigations have introduced additional evidence without ending the discussion. Chemical signatures preserved in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica have begun suggesting dates closer to the 1500s before the Common Era, lending partial support to the archaeological framework derived from Egypt. Even so, those findings have not erased the radiocarbon results recovered from Akrotiri itself. As of 2026, no consensus has emerged. The olive branch preserved within volcanic pumice continues supporting one chronology. Egyptian pottery and historical synchronization continue supporting another. Between them stands one of the most remarkable scientific debates in ancient history, reminding us that even carefully preserved evidence can speak with more than one voice. For more than 3,000 years, an entire town rested beyond ordinary sight, protected by the same volcanic deposits that had ended its daily life. Farmers crossed the island above it. Villages rose and changed. Empires appeared and disappeared across the Mediterranean. Beneath those passing centuries, streets, homes, and workshops remained enclosed within layers of pumice and ash, waiting for an unexpected encounter rather than a planned search. That encounter began during the 1860s. The first signs of the buried settlement emerged through industrial work instead of archaeology. A French company extracting volcanic material for construction associated with the Suez Canal cut into the eastern edge of Akrotiri. Workers uncovered sections of ancient walls together with other traces of human occupation. The discovery attracted notice among scholars, yet no large excavation followed. The exposed remains were recorded, then gradually slipped back into relative obscurity while attention turned elsewhere. Nearly 100 years passed before systematic exploration finally began. In 1967, Greek archaeologist Spyridon Marinatos opened excavations driven by an idea he had defended for decades. He believed the eruption of Thera had played a decisive role in the decline of Minoan civilization, and he hoped the buried settlement would preserve evidence supporting that argument. His professional reputation became closely linked with the success or failure of the search, giving every trench added significance. The excavation soon revealed something greater than almost anyone had anticipated. Instead of scattered ruins, archaeologists uncovered an exceptionally preserved urban landscape. Stone streets still followed their original routes between buildings. Walls survived to heights of 3 and 4 stories. Large storage jars remained standing where they had last been placed. Staircases connected floors that had not seen human footsteps since the Bronze Age. Rooms retained traces of daily activity, allowing researchers to move through spaces that still reflected the organization of an active community. Comparisons with Pompeii naturally followed, though the similarities only tell part of the story. Akrotiri reached its final moments, roughly 1,500 years before the Roman city disappeared beneath the eruption of Vesuvius. Its preservation also followed a different path. The earliest volcanic deposits accumulated with enough gradual consistency to support many structures before heavier material sealed them more completely. As a result, remarkable portions of the town endured with architectural integrity rarely encountered at sites of comparable age. Excavation brought moments of profound achievement together with personal loss. During 1974, Marinatos died after falling into one of the excavation trenches at the site he had devoted much of his career to uncovering. He never witnessed the full extent of the city that continued emerging season after season, nor the lasting influence his work would have upon Bronze Age archaeology. Research has continued ever since and remains active as of 2026. To protect the exposed settlement from changing weather, engineers constructed a modern bioclimatic shelter supported by 96 steel columns. Elevated metal walkways carry visitors above the ancient streets, allowing close views without disturbing the fragile remains below. From those paths, storage vessels still stand inside former rooms. Drainage channels trace the routes of sophisticated plumbing, and carefully conserved frescoes reveal the locations from which they were removed for preservation. Even after decades of excavation, only part of Akrotiri has been uncovered. The city continues, extending beyond the explored areas, preserving untold chapters of Bronze Age life within the volcanic layers that first concealed it and ultimately ensured its extraordinary survival. Paint can preserve moments that stone alone cannot. Within the walls of Akrotiri, color survived where voices disappeared, leaving behind scenes that still feel immediate after more than 3,000 years. These frescoes are far more than decorative ornaments. Together, they form a visual archive of Bronze Age life, revealing clothing, food, landscapes, occupations, travel, ceremonies, and encounters with distant lands. Every carefully painted surface offers another fragment of a civilization, speaking through images instead of written words. Among the most celebrated works is the Fleet fresco from the West House. A continuous painted band once circled the upper walls of an entire room, guiding the eye from one harbor to another through a lively maritime procession. Long ships move across open water with disciplined rows of oarsmen. Passengers stand upon the decks while settlements climb nearby hillsides overlooking sheltered bays. Dolphins swim beside the vessels, adding movement to an already animated scene. Nothing within the composition demands a mythical interpretation. Many scholars regard it as the depiction of an actual voyage, perhaps even the record of a memorable expedition witnessed by the artist. Another pair of paintings presents two fishermen carrying long strings of freshly caught fish over their shoulders. Their bodies are rendered with remarkable confidence, displaying careful attention to posture and proportion. The fish themselves contain enough anatomical detail for specialists to identify several species with considerable certainty. Such accuracy suggests close observation of daily work rather than symbolic invention. The paintings preserve an ordinary occupation with the same care often reserved for rulers or heroes in other cultures. Children also appear with unusual prominence. The Boxing Boys fresco portrays two youthful figures facing one another while wearing protective gloves. Their expressions remain composed as they prepare for friendly competition. They seem to be around 9 or 10 years of age, though exact estimates vary. The scene carries no obvious military purpose or solemn ceremony. Instead, it reveals childhood as a stage filled with exercise, skill, and recreation, reminding modern viewers that youthful experiences often transcended the immense distances of history. Nearby, another remarkable composition follows groups of young females gathering saffron blossoms from flowering crocus plants. Scholars continue discussing whether these figures represent girls approaching adulthood or mature women participating in established traditions. Saffron ranked among the most valuable products of the Bronze Age, prized for medicine, fragrance, textiles, and ritual use. The fresco suggests that collecting it formed part of everyday seasonal activity, while also carrying cultural or ceremonial importance beyond its practical value. The Blue Monkey's fresco expands the horizon still farther. Brightly colored primates climb rocky outcrops unlike animals native to the Aegean Islands. Many researchers identify them as monkeys related to species found in sub-Saharan Africa. Their presence within Akrotiri's paintings implies knowledge gained through long-distance exchange, whether by direct travel or imported artistic traditions. The image reflects a Mediterranean world connected through maritime networks, extending across continents, carrying ideas alongside valuable goods. Equally celebrated is the Spring Fresco, a composition devoted almost entirely to the natural world. Red lilies emerge from volcanic rock, while swallows wheel through open air above them. Human figures are absent, as are gods, rulers, or legendary creatures. Attention rests completely upon plants, birds, and landscape. Many art historians regard this work as the earliest known landscape painting in European history, created for its own visual beauty. Through these preserved walls, Akrotiri offers something exceptionally uncommon, an opportunity to witness Bronze Age life through the eyes of artists who painted the familiar world exactly as they experienced it. Among all the discoveries made beneath the volcanic deposits of Akrotiri, one absence has proven more striking than any object recovered from the ground. Archaeologists have uncovered streets, workshops, storerooms, painted walls, and household possessions, yet the people themselves are almost entirely missing. For a settlement that once supported thousands of residents, the lack of human remains one of the most remarkable features of the site, inviting careful examination rather than simple explanation. Excavation has revealed no clusters of bodies within homes, no victims lying across roads, and no burial pits filled during the final crisis. Rooms preserve furniture, storage vessels, and architectural details with extraordinary completeness, yet those who once occupied them had already departed. This pattern differs sharply from many other volcanic disasters, where escaping became impossible during the final moments. At Akrotiri, the archaeological record suggests a population that had already begun responding before the greatest violence arrived. Only one confirmed individual has emerged from decades of excavation. During 1999, researchers uncovered skeletal remains beneath a collapsed wall. The person's age and biological sex remain uncertain because preservation was incomplete and surrounding evidence offers few clear answers. Even so, the discovery stands as the sole confirmed human casualty recovered from the settlement itself. One life remains visible within the archaeological record, while thousands of others continue to exist only as an unanswered question. A second mystery accompanies the first. Wealthy residences, identified through elaborate architecture and richly painted interiors, contain remarkably little gold or silver. Valuable jewelry is almost entirely absent. Precious portable possessions that might normally remain inside prosperous households had already disappeared before the volcanic deposits sealed the buildings. The contrast suggests deliberate preparation rather than hurried abandonment. Families appear to have gathered the belongings they valued most before leaving the town behind. Signs preserved within the buildings help explain how such an organized departure became possible. Numerous walls display earthquake damage that clearly occurred before the first volcanic deposits settled across the city. Cracks, repairs, and collapsed sections belong to an earlier sequence of seismic disturbances, indicating that the island experienced escalating instability before the climactic eruption. These repeated earthquakes likely served as unmistakable warnings that conditions were becoming increasingly dangerous. Such evidence points toward an evacuation unfolding across days, or perhaps even weeks, instead of desperate flight, measured only in minutes. Boats could have been loaded gradually with families, tools, supplies, and treasured possessions while the harbor remained usable. Livestock may also have been moved where circumstances allowed. Each departure would have reduced the population still present when the final eruption transformed the island forever. The destination of those refugees remains uncertain because the people of Akrotiri left almost no written records that modern scholars can read. Crete stands as the most widely accepted possibility, supported by strong maritime connections linking the islands before the disaster. Others may have sailed toward the western coast of Anatolia or neighboring islands throughout the Aegean. Their arrival would have blended naturally into communities already connected through trade and shared cultural traditions, leaving few traces distinguishable after so many centuries. The greatest irony rests within that possibility. The city vanished beneath volcanic deposits, yet many of its inhabitants may have survived the catastrophe that destroyed their homes. Their knowledge, skills, and memories could have continued elsewhere, carried across the sea instead of buried beneath it. Even if the people escaped, the wider civilization to which they belonged entered a period of profound transformation from which it never fully recovered. The strength of Minoan civilization rested along the northern shoreline of Crete, where sheltered harbors connected the island to every corner of the eastern Mediterranean. Merchant vessels unloaded raw materials beside busy quays, while local ships departed carrying crafted goods, olive oil, wine, textiles, and ceramics. Ports such as Amnisos, Malia, Palicastro, and the coastal facilities serving Knossos formed the living arteries of an economy sustained by movement across the sea. Their prosperity depended upon predictable voyages that linked distant communities into a single commercial network. That network encountered an overwhelming force when the waves generated by the eruption reached Crete. Geological models differ in their precise estimates, yet many indicate water heights ranging from roughly 30 feet to more than 100 feet along sections of the northern coast. Local geography influenced the final impact. Narrow bays concentrated the incoming water, while open stretches dispersed part of its energy. Even with those variations, the coastline experienced destruction on a scale unmatched in living memory. Amnisos provides some of the clearest archaeological evidence. Excavations have uncovered volcanic pumice deposited far inland together with large stone blocks resting in positions difficult to explain through ordinary coastal processes. Their arrangement corresponds closely with violent marine inundation, powerful enough to tear apart waterfront structures before carrying heavy material across the landscape. These discoveries complement geological evidence gathered elsewhere along the coast, where exceptional wave action left lasting signatures within sediment and damaged architecture. Some geological studies suggest the force of the water displaced sections of masonry by more than 190 feet at locations approximately 37 miles from Thera. Such movement required tremendous energy acting across only a brief interval. Harbors designed for commerce offered little protection against water arriving with that level of momentum. Piers, warehouses, workshops, and storage areas would have faced catastrophic damage as repeated surges advanced and retreated through the coastal settlements. The Minoan fleet likely suffered at the same time. Ships anchored within their familiar harbors suddenly became vulnerable as mooring lines failed, vessels collided, and debris filled the water. Many boats were probably driven ashore or shattered against stone quays before crews could organize an effective response. Maritime strength had long supported trade, communication, diplomacy, and security throughout the region. Losing a substantial portion of that fleet within a single morning would have transformed daily life across the island. The consequences extended well beyond transportation. Palace economies relied upon imported copper and tin for bronze production, timber for construction, and valuable goods that reinforced political alliances through exchange and gift-giving. Once regular shipping collapsed, these carefully balanced systems struggled to function. Craftsmen lacked essential materials, merchants lost dependable routes, and administrators faced increasing difficulty maintaining the economic relationships that supported Minoan authority. Conditions on land offered little relief. Northeastern Crete received roughly 6 inches of volcanic ash, enough to smother crops already growing in cultivated fields. Fresh volcanic deposits disrupted soil chemistry, delaying productive harvests through multiple growing seasons, while livestock encountered contaminated forage and water. Agricultural recovery required patience that communities, already burdened by wider losses, could scarcely afford. Fishing communities faced another challenge, as floating pumice covered broad areas of the sea and volcanic substances altered coastal waters. Boats that survived the waves encountered obstructed routes and damaged fishing grounds, reducing another important source of food and commerce. Within a remarkably short span, Crete confronted damaged harbors, diminished fleets, interrupted trade, weakened harvests, stressed fisheries, contaminated water supplies, and the arrival of displaced survivors from Thera. Each hardship reinforced the next, placing extraordinary pressure upon a civilization whose greatest achievements had depended upon stability across both land and sea. History rarely changes in a single moment. Even after a catastrophe capable of reshaping coastlines and trade routes, societies often continue through determination, memory, and habit. The Minoans did exactly that. Their civilization did not vanish when the eruption ended. Daily life resumed where it still could. Administrators returned to their work, artisans resumed their crafts, and communities sought to rebuild a world that had suddenly become far less predictable. The strongest evidence comes from Knossos. Archaeological excavations show that the palace remained occupied following the eruption and continued serving as an administrative center for many years. Builders repaired damaged structures, expanded portions of the complex, and introduced new architectural features that reflected confidence rather than immediate collapse. Storerooms remained active, workshops continued producing fine goods, and official administration carried forward through systems that had survived the first great shock. The palace retained its importance within the island's political landscape, even after the wider region had endured extraordinary disruption. Material culture from the following generations also speaks of resilience. Archaeologists identify the succeeding phase as late Minoan First B, a period marked by fresh, artistic developments and refined craftsmanship. Pottery styles evolved with distinctive forms and decorative patterns. Buildings received new embellishments, demonstrating that skilled labor remained available. Trade with Egypt and the Levant continued, though on a diminished scale compared with earlier prosperity. These developments have led some researchers to describe the period as a limited cultural renewal, showing that creative life continued despite the hardships left by the eruption. Beneath these outward signs of recovery, however, the foundations supporting Minoan influence had changed. Maritime exchange had long connected Crete with distant suppliers and trading partners. Those sea routes depended upon dependable fleets, secure harbors, and commercial confidence developed over generations. Although navigation gradually resumed, the network never regained its former reach or reliability. Interruptions that once might have been temporary became lasting weaknesses within the economic system. Other societies recognized those changing conditions. On mainland Greece, the Mycenaeans had already spent generations observing and learning from their southern neighbors. Their artists adopted Minoan decorative traditions, while their craftsmen borrowed techniques visible in pottery, architecture, and luxury goods. Commercial relationships connected both cultures long before the eruption. Even so, the balance between them had favored Crete, whose maritime strength allowed it to dominate many exchanges throughout the Aegean. As Minoan influence weakened, opportunities emerged for ambitious neighbors. The Mycenaeans possessed functioning communities untouched by the direct devastation experienced on Thera and the northern coast of Crete. Gradually, they expanded their presence within trading networks that no longer rested securely under Minoan leadership. This transition unfolded across decades rather than through sudden conquest, reflecting shifting commercial realities as much as political ambition. Religious life may also have changed during this prolonged recovery. Archaeologists studying Knossos have identified unusual ritual deposits dating to the generations after the eruption. Some scholars suggest these discoveries indicate more frequent ceremonial activity and an increased emphasis upon offerings during a period of prolonged uncertainty. This pattern has been described as stress religion, a term used when communities respond to sustained hardship by intensifying established religious practices instead of creating entirely new beliefs. Such interpretations remain debated, yet they offer another glimpse into how people adapted while confronting an altered world. The effort to restore Minoan prosperity continued for perhaps 150 years. Palaces functioned, artists painted, merchants sailed, and traditions endured. Even so, the conditions that had once sustained Minoan supremacy gradually slipped beyond recovery. The civilization remained alive through remarkable persistence, yet the wider balance of power within the Aegean had already begun moving in another direction. Time can conceal the exact cause of an ending while preserving the marks it left behind. Across Crete, archaeologists encounter a striking pattern during the middle of the Bronze Age. Several great palace centers reached the close of their histories within roughly the same generation. Fire swept through monumental buildings, roofs gave way, walls collapsed, and administrative life came to an abrupt halt. The sequence appears at Knossos, Phaistos, Hagia Triada, Malea, and Zakros, suggesting that the island experienced a transformation extending far beyond a single settlement. The traditional explanation has long pointed toward the Mycenaeans of mainland Greece. By about 1450, before the Common Era, roughly 150 years after the eruption of Thera, these neighboring people had grown in wealth and organization. They had traded with the Minoans for generations, learning artistic techniques, architectural ideas, and elements of palace administration. According to the conventional interpretation, they eventually crossed the sea in force, taking advantage of a civilization already weakened by decades of economic strain and diminished maritime influence. The archaeological record, however, refuses to settle the matter with complete certainty. Burned buildings clearly testify to destruction, yet evidence expected from widespread battlefield fighting remains surprisingly limited. Excavations have not uncovered large numbers of skeletons lying where combat ended their lives. Burials from this period generally appear orderly rather than hurried. Such observations have encouraged some scholars to consider different possibilities, including political conflict within Crete itself, regional revolts, or the gradual failure of palace authority that ultimately erupted into violence. Each explanation accounts for part of the evidence while leaving important questions unanswered. Although the exact cause remains debated, the aftermath speaks with much greater clarity. Administrative practices at Knossos underwent a profound change. Clay tablets that had once carried inscriptions in Linear A gradually gave way to a different writing system known as Linear B. The replacement represented far more than a new method of recording information. It reflected the arrival of an entirely different administrative tradition connected with Mycenaean society. For many years, the language recorded in Linear B remained unreadable. Scholars copied the symbols with great care, yet their meaning resisted interpretation. During 1952, British architect Michael Ventris achieved the breakthrough that transformed the study of Bronze Age Greece. Working through painstaking analysis, he demonstrated that the tablets recorded an early form of the Greek language rather than the speech of the Minoans. A script once thought mysterious suddenly revealed warehouses, livestock, offerings, and officials belonging to a different cultural world. Linear A, by contrast, has never been deciphered. Its symbols survive upon tablets, seals, and ceremonial objects, preserving the written expression of Minoan administration without yielding its language to modern readers. When Linear B replaced it within the palace bureaucracy, the change marked the transfer of political authority as well as written communication. The language governing the island had become the language of newcomers. Knossos continued functioning for several generations after many other palaces had fallen, serving as the principal administrative center under Mycenaean control. That final phase eventually reached its own conclusion around 1375, before the Common Era. Palace administration ceased, and the institution that had shaped Minoan civilization for centuries disappeared from history. The people themselves did not vanish. Their descendants continued living across Crete, preserving customs, craftsmanship, beliefs, and memories that gradually blended with those of the Mycenaeans. Even so, Minoan civilization as an independent cultural power had come to its end. Its language fell from official use, its rulers no longer governed, and its legacy passed into later Greek civilization, where many of its earliest achievements endured without always carrying the name of those who first created them. Some discoveries preserve their greatest mystery in plain sight. Museums display them behind glass, archaeologists photograph them from every angle, and scholars publish careful drawings of every sign. Even so, their meaning remains beyond reach. Linear A belongs to that uncommon category of evidence, a writing system visible to everyone yet understood by no one, carrying messages that have crossed more than 3,000 years without surrendering their voice. The script appeared across Crete during roughly 1800, before the Common Era, and remained in use until about 1450, before the Common Era. Archaeologists have recovered hundreds of inscriptions written in Linear A from settlements throughout Crete, as well as neighboring islands in the Aegean. The symbols occur on administrative clay tablets, painted pottery, stone libation tables placed within mountain sanctuaries, ritual vessels, seals, and other objects connected with everyday administration and religious practice. This was not an occasional ceremonial script. It formed part of ordinary life within Minoan society. Its abundance makes the mystery even more remarkable. Many undeciphered scripts survive only in a handful of damaged examples, leaving scholars with little material for analysis. Linear A presents the opposite situation. Researchers possess hundreds of texts, carefully preserved and extensively cataloged. For more than 100 years, linguists, archaeologists, historians, and specialists in ancient writing systems have examined these inscriptions with extraordinary care. Despite those efforts, the language recorded by the symbols remains unknown. Part of the difficulty becomes clear when compared with Linear B. The later script shares several visual signs with Linear A and eventually replaced it after Mycenaean administration spread across Crete. During 1952, Michael Ventris demonstrated that Linear B recorded an early form of the Greek language. Once the spoken language beneath the symbols became recognizable, many inscriptions could finally be understood. Warehouses, livestock, offerings, and official records gradually emerged from texts that had long resisted interpretation. Linear A offers no comparable pathway. Scholars have assigned many signs the same approximate sound values used in Linear B because the scripts resemble one another in important ways. Reading the inscriptions with those sounds produces sequences of syllables, yet the resulting words correspond to no known language. They fit neither Greek nor any established language family from the surrounding regions. Current evidence suggests that the language spoken by the Minoans may have existed as a language isolate, developing independently from the major linguistic groups recognized today. This limitation reaches far beyond grammar or vocabulary. Archaeology reveals homes, workshops, ports, storage systems, religious objects, and remarkable works of art. Excavations reconstruct trade routes, agricultural practices, and patterns of administration with increasing precision. Yet the people responsible for those achievements remain unable to introduce themselves in their own words. Their names for rulers, places, deities, festivals, and perhaps even for Crete itself remain concealed within inscriptions that modern readers can identify but cannot comprehend. The search, therefore, continues with careful patience. Every newly recovered inscription expands the available evidence, though none has yet transformed understanding in the way scholars once hoped. Many researchers believe the decisive breakthrough may depend upon discovering a bilingual text, one presenting linear A beside another writing system whose language is already known. Such a document would serve the same role that unlocked other undeciphered scripts from the ancient world. Until that discovery arrives, the written voice of Europe's earliest civilization remains present before our eyes, carrying meanings that still rest beyond translation. Across the southern horizon of the eastern Mediterranean, another civilization flourished beside a very different landscape. Egypt and the Minoan world maintained enduring connections through commerce, diplomacy, and the steady movement of ships carrying valuable cargo between their ports. Although separated by the sea, they belonged to an interconnected network whose exchanges carried ideas as readily as goods. That relationship makes one historical puzzle especially striking, for evidence of contact is plentiful while evidence describing the eruption itself remains remarkably scarce. Egyptian tomb paintings preserve images of visitors arriving from the Aegean, bringing finely crafted objects as offerings or tribute. Many scholars identify these figures as Minoans because of their clothing, hairstyles, and distinctive gifts. Archaeological excavations in Egypt have also uncovered pottery produced on Crete, confirming that trade reached well beyond occasional voyages. Egyptian luxury goods traveled north, while Cretan merchants carried products shaped by workshops already familiar from earlier chapters of this story. Their commercial partnership formed one of the strongest international relationships of the Bronze Age. Considering those close connections, historians might reasonably expect Egyptian scribes to have recorded an eruption capable of scattering ash across distant regions and disturbing maritime travel throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Yet no surviving royal decree, temple inscription, or administrative document clearly describes the eruption of Thera. The absence stands in contrast to Egypt's usual habit of preserving events through carved monuments, official records, and religious texts. Sometimes history leaves behind an account of what occurred. At other times, it preserves only the outline of what appears to be missing. The historical setting offers one possible explanation. During much of the period associated with the eruption, Egypt experienced the era known as the Second Intermediate Period. Political authority had become divided, and rulers known as the Hyksos controlled much of the Nile Delta after arriving from the Levant. Regional governments functioned independently, while centralized administration became far less stable than during stronger dynasties. Under such conditions, the careful record keeping that characterized more unified periods may have become uneven, allowing even remarkable events beyond Egypt's borders to pass without lasting official documentation. One ancient composition often enters this discussion. Known as the Admonitions of Ippur, it survives in a single papyrus copied centuries after the events it may describe. The text presents a troubled landscape where rivers resemble blood, harvests fail, cattle perish, darkness spreads, and established social order breaks apart. Some researchers have suggested these images preserve distant memories of environmental disruption associated with the eruption, perhaps including blooms of red algae or other natural phenomena affecting waterways. Many other scholars reject that interpretation, arguing the work belongs to an earlier literary tradition and should not be read as a historical account of Thera. The debate remains unresolved. Another document attracts similar attention. The Tempest Stele of Pharaoh Ahmose records violent storms, darkness, damaged buildings, and widespread destruction during the ruler's reign around 1550 before the Common Era. Some specialists interpret the inscription as evidence of extraordinary atmospheric disturbances linked to the eruption. Others view it as conventional royal language, celebrating recovery after severe weather, unrelated to volcanic activity. The surviving inscription allows both possibilities to remain under discussion. Perhaps the greatest lesson lies within the silence itself. One of the largest volcanic eruptions of the Bronze Age unfolded within a world, connected by trade, diplomacy, and shared seas. Fragments of memory appear in archaeology, literature, and stone inscriptions, yet no single contemporary account explains the event with certainty. The ancient Mediterranean preserved many echoes of that upheaval, though its clearest voice may have been the remarkable absence left between surviving records. Far from the islands of the eastern Mediterranean, where no harbor, palace, or painted wall survived to witness the eruption, another archive has been preserving its memory with extraordinary fidelity. Layer upon layer of snow accumulated across the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica until the weight of countless winters compressed it into solid ice. Each annual layer sealed away tiny samples of the atmosphere above it, creating a continuous record that reaches back hundreds of thousands of years. When a powerful volcano erupts, enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide rise high into the stratosphere. There, the gas gradually transforms into droplets of sulfuric acid that drift around the globe before settling back to Earth. In polar regions, these microscopic particles become trapped within freshly fallen snow. As new snowfall buries older layers, the chemical traces remain preserved in chronological order, forming a natural archive that can survive for immense spans of time with remarkable stability. Scientists recover this history by drilling deep cylindrical cores through the ice. Each core resembles a frozen timeline, with younger layers resting above progressively older ones. Researchers examine the cores section by section, identifying annual layers through changes in texture, chemistry, trapped air, and seasonal patterns. Within those frozen sequences, they detect volcanic events by measuring unusual concentrations of sulfate, allowing eruptions from the distant past to be recognized even when they occurred thousands of miles away. The eruption of Thera left one of those chemical fingerprints. Sulfate deposits consistent with a major volcanic event appear in both Greenland and Antarctic ice cores, confirming that the eruption injected material high into the stratosphere. Only eruptions powerful enough to reach those upper layers of the atmosphere can distribute aerosols across both hemispheres in ways that become preserved within polar ice. The signal demonstrates that Thera affected the atmosphere on a global scale, extending its influence far beyond the eastern Mediterranean. Even so, comparison with more recent eruptions provides important perspective. The sulfate layer attributed to Thera appears smaller than the corresponding signals produced by eruptions such as Tambora and Pinatubo. Those later events generated stronger atmospheric disturbances and more pronounced short-term climatic effects visible within the chemical record. This difference suggests that while Thera certainly influenced global climate, its worldwide consequences were probably less severe than some earlier scientific models had proposed. The ice also preserves another puzzle that has occupied researchers for decades. Sulfate layers associated with the eruption appear at slightly different points, depending upon which ice core is examined and which dating method is applied. Some chronologies place the event during the 17th century before the Common Era, while others favor dates closer to the 15th century before the Common Era. Small differences in annual layer counting accumulate across long intervals, making exact calendar placement surprisingly difficult despite the precision of modern techniques. Evidence from other natural archives strengthens the connection. Tiny fragments of volcanic ash, known as tephra, possess distinctive chemical compositions reflecting the magma from which they formed. The elemental signature of Thera has been identified in sediment cores recovered from the Mediterranean, lake deposits in present-day Turkey, sediments near the Black Sea, and even within Antarctic ice. No other Bronze Age eruption matches this unique geochemical pattern. Together, these frozen records establish one conclusion beyond reasonable doubt. The eruption truly occurred, its atmospheric effects reached around the world, and nature itself preserved enduring evidence of that extraordinary event. The remaining challenge lies not in proving that Thera erupted, but in determining the exact year when Earth's atmosphere first captured its unmistakable chemical signature. A traveler arriving at Santorini today encounters a landscape shaped by beauty, yet every cliff and curve owes its existence to extraordinary destruction. Whitewashed homes stand along steep volcanic walls, narrow pathways follow the edge of towering cliffs, and a broad expanse of deep blue water occupies the center of the island. The scenery appears timeless, although nearly every feature visible from those heights was created during the eruption that transformed the Bronze Age world. Before that event, the island formed a much more complete volcanic structure. Its outline was broadly circular, enclosing a central volcanic complex built through repeated eruptions across many thousands of years. During the final stage of the Minoan eruption, an immense volume of magma had already escaped from beneath the volcano. Without that support, the ground above the emptied chamber collapsed inward. The sea gradually flooded the newly formed depression, producing the great caldera that defines Santorini today. The graceful crescent, photographed by millions of visitors, is therefore only the surviving rim of a volcano whose center disappeared more than 3,000 years ago. The caldera stretches about 7.5 miles from one side to the other, while its submerged floor reaches depths of roughly 1,300 feet below the surrounding sea surface. Those dimensions reveal the tremendous scale of the collapse. Standing along the cliffs, it becomes possible to appreciate how much of the original volcano vanished during a remarkably brief interval. The present coastline marks the surviving edges of a landscape permanently reshaped by forces rising from deep within Earth's crust. Life within the volcanic system did not end after the collapse. Near the center of the flooded caldera stand two younger islands, Nea Kamenni and Palea Kamenni. Neither existed when the Minoans flourished. They emerged afterward as fresh volcanic cones built by repeated eruptions that slowly accumulated layers of hardened lava above the water. Their dark, rocky surfaces contrast with the older cliffs surrounding them, illustrating that volcanic construction continued long after the great eruption had concluded. Nea Kamenni has erupted at least 12 times since the 2nd century of the Common Era. The most recent eruption occurred during 1950, producing fresh lava flows and reminding observers that molten rock still rises beneath the caldera. Although long intervals of calm often separate eruptive episodes, the volcanic system remains active. Heat continues circulating below the surface, feeding hot springs and sustaining the geological processes that first created the island. Modern scientific instruments now observe Santorini with a level of precision unavailable to earlier generations. During early 2025, thousands of small earthquakes occurred beneath the region across several weeks, drawing worldwide attention from volcanologists and seismologists. Authorities issued temporary evacuation measures for portions of the island while researchers carefully evaluated the activity. Detailed analysis indicated that the earthquake sequence most likely reflected movement along regional fault systems instead of magma rising toward an eruption. Even so, the episode demonstrated that Santorini remains a dynamic volcanic environment rather than a preserved relic of distant history. The towering caldera walls offer scientists another remarkable gift. Each exposed layer of ash, pumice, and solidified lava records an earlier chapter in the volcano's development, preserving one of Europe's most complete volcanic stratigraphic sequences. Reading those bands resembles turning the pages of an immense geological autobiography, revealing countless eruptions that unfolded long before the first Minoan sailors crossed the surrounding sea. The landscape, admired today, is therefore both destination and document, preserving within its cliffs the enduring record of Earth's continuing creativity. Stories often outlive the civilizations that first inspired them. They travel across generations, changing with every retelling until memory and imagination become difficult to separate. By the time they are finally written down, they may preserve fragments of real events wrapped within new settings and unfamiliar details. Few legends illustrate that possibility more vividly than the enduring account of Atlantis. Around 360 before the Common Era, the Athenian philosopher Plato composed two dialogues known as Timaeus and Critias. Within those works, he described a wealthy island power possessing impressive engineering, formidable naval strength, and abundant natural riches. According to the narrative, that civilization met its end during a single day and night of extraordinary earthquakes and floods, after which the island disappeared beneath the sea. Plato located Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the waterway now known as the Strait of Gibraltar, and stated that its destruction had occurred about 9,000 years before his own lifetime. Most classical historians regard the account as philosophical literature rather than literal history. Plato frequently employed fictional settings and invented conversations to explore political ideas. In this interpretation, Atlantis served as an illustration of excessive ambition, moral decline, and the consequences awaiting societies that allowed power to eclipse wisdom. The catastrophe became part of a carefully constructed argument instead of a preserved historical record. Another possibility emerged during the 19th century and continues to attract scholarly discussion. Some researchers have suggested that Plato's narrative may preserve a distant cultural memory of the Minoan civilization and the eruption of Thera. Over many centuries, stories passed from one generation to another often accumulate changes while retaining recognizable elements of the original event. Oral tradition can reshape geography, chronology, and symbolism without entirely erasing the historical experience that first inspired the tale. Several similarities encourage this comparison. The Minoans created one of the greatest maritime civilizations of the Bronze Age, building prosperity upon seaborne trade and skilled navigation. Thera experienced an immense volcanic catastrophe involving earthquakes, collapsing land, and overwhelming waves. The volcanic caldera formed when much of the island gave way into the emptied magma chamber, leaving part of the former landscape beneath the sea. Within the following centuries, Minoan political independence disappeared, replaced by Mycenaean authority. Taken together, Those developments bear a broad resemblance to the themes preserved within Plato's account. Important differences remain equally difficult to ignore. Plato clearly situated Atlantis beyond the Strait of Gibraltar instead of within the Aegean. His chronology places the disaster roughly 9,000 years before his own era, many thousands of years earlier than the Minoan civilization. He also described features including concentric rings of land and water surrounding a magnificent capital, together with an immense plain unlike the landscapes known from Crete or Santorini. Archaeology has uncovered no site matching that complete description. Some scholars have explored whether those inconsistencies might reflect misunderstandings accumulated during transmission. Plato stated that the story reached him through Egyptian sources before entering Greek tradition. A few researchers have proposed that differences between Egyptian and Greek numerical systems could have transformed an original figure of about 900 years into 9,000 years during translation. Such ideas remain speculative and have not achieved scholarly consensus, yet they illustrate the complexity of tracing memories across many centuries. Whether Atlantis originated from imagination, history, or a blend of both, the comparison continues because the Minoan world offers the closest known parallel. A prosperous island civilization flourished upon the sea, suffered an extraordinary natural catastrophe, gradually disappeared as an independent power, and left behind ruins that inspired wonder long after its language had fallen beyond understanding. Civilizations sometimes disappear from written history while remaining alive in stories. Their cities become unfamiliar, their language falls beyond understanding, and their rulers lose their names. Even so, memories linger within legends told by later generations. Across Greek mythology, many of those echoes seem to lead back toward Bronze Age Crete, where fragments of a vanished world may have been transformed into tales of heroes, monsters, and impossible places. Among the most familiar figures is King Minos, remembered as the ruler of Crete and master of a powerful island kingdom whose influence reached across the Aegean. Greek tradition describes him receiving tribute from Athens in the form of 7 young men and 7 young women, each delivered to a fearsome creature hidden within an enormous labyrinth. Whether this account preserves history or imagination remains impossible to determine, yet the prominence of Minos is striking. His association with Cretan kingship became so enduring that Sir Arthur Evans eventually chose the name to identify the civilization uncovered beneath the ruins of Knossos. The labyrinth itself has inspired centuries of speculation. Archaeologists have found no true maze beneath the palace at Knossos. Even so, the immense complex contained hundreds of interconnected rooms, winding corridors, stairways, storage magazines, ceremonial chambers, and multiple levels joined through intricate architectural planning. Visitors unfamiliar with such buildings could easily lose their sense of direction within its interior. To people arriving from simpler settlements on mainland Greece, the palace may well have seemed like a structure from which escape was uncertain. Language offers another intriguing clue. Some scholars have suggested that the word labyrinth may share an origin with the term labres, referring to the distinctive double axe that appeared frequently within Minoan religious symbolism. The double axe decorated sanctuaries, ceremonial objects, and sacred spaces throughout Crete. Although the proposed connection remains debated, the resemblance has encouraged generations of researchers to consider whether the very name of the legendary maze preserves an echo of Minoan ritual life. The creature said to inhabit that maze also carries familiar elements. Archaeology has demonstrated that bulls occupied a prominent place within Minoan religion and ceremonial practice. Frescoes from Knossos and other sites depict athletes performing spectacular leaps over charging bulls during carefully organized rituals. Such ceremonies would have appeared astonishing to neighboring societies unfamiliar with these traditions. Stories describing fearless performers vaulting across powerful animals may gradually have evolved into accounts of a monstrous being that combined human and bull within a single terrifying figure. Across many generations of retelling, ritual could become legend. The story of Theseus adds another layer that some historians find difficult to overlook. In Greek mythology, the young hero journeys to Crete, enters the labyrinth, kills the Minotaur, and brings an end to the tribute demanded from Athens. While no evidence suggests that these events occurred literally, the narrative resembles a symbolic reversal of political power. Some scholars have proposed that it preserves a distant cultural memory of Mycenaean dominance replacing Minoan authority, expressed through heroic storytelling rather than historical record. Another enduring legend centers upon Daedalus and his son Icarus. Daedalus appears as a master craftsman capable of astonishing engineering, credited with constructing the labyrinth before escaping Crete upon wings fashioned from feathers and wax. The miraculous flight belongs firmly within mythology, yet the admiration directed toward Daedalus may reflect memories of remarkable Minoan builders whose achievements seemed almost supernatural to later generations. Sophisticated drainage systems, carefully planned palaces, and advanced urban design could easily inspire tales celebrating extraordinary skill. The Minoans gradually disappeared as an independent civilization, yet their presence remained woven through the imagination of those who followed. Their language faded, their rulers became legendary figures, their ceremonies transformed into heroic adventures, and their architecture evolved into places inhabited by myth. History ended one chapter, while storytelling carried its surviving shadows forward through the centuries. One of the most enduring discussions surrounding the Minoan civilization concerns neither the eruption itself nor the ruins it left behind. It centers upon cause and consequence. Archaeology presents a sequence of events that appears straightforward at first glance, yet becomes increasingly complex as each layer of evidence is examined. The Great Eruption occurred around 1600, before the Common Era, while the final political collapse of Minoan power arrived roughly 150 years later. That interval has shaped decades of scientific debate. One interpretation gives the eruption a central role. The volcano damaged the foundations upon which Minoan prosperity rested. Coastal harbors suffered tremendous destruction. Ships disappeared. Productive farmland experienced disruption, and regional trade routes became less dependable. These losses affected more than individual communities. Palace administration relied upon maritime exchange, agricultural surpluses, and reliable communication among settlements scattered across the Aegean. Damage to those interconnected systems represented a profound structural shock that could not easily be repaired. Material evidence supports many parts of this argument. Archaeologists have documented tsunami deposits, volcanic ash, damaged coastal settlements, and disruptions within commercial networks that had previously linked Crete with neighboring regions. Such discoveries indicate that the eruption produced genuine economic and logistical consequences rather than theoretical possibilities. A civilization whose wealth depended upon movement across the sea inevitably faced lasting difficulties when that maritime world changed so dramatically. Another body of evidence encourages greater caution. The Minoans clearly continued living, governing, trading, and building after the eruption. Knossos remained an important administrative center, while several palace complexes experienced rebuilding and continued occupation. Imported goods from Egypt still reached Crete during the 15th century before the Common Era, demonstrating that overseas commerce never disappeared entirely. If the eruption had completely destroyed Minoan civilization during 1600 before the Common Era, these later signs of political organization and international exchange would be difficult to explain. Attention has therefore expanded beyond the eruption alone. Some researchers have proposed that environmental conditions gradually became less favorable during the generations following the disaster. A study published during 2010 in the journal Climate of the Past suggested that increasing dryness and less predictable rainfall across the Aegean may have progressively weakened agricultural production. Palace economies depended upon dependable harvests collected, stored, and redistributed through centralized administration. Repeated pressure upon farming could slowly erode that system even without another catastrophic event. Additional hypotheses consider broader climate patterns. Some scientists have explored whether the eruption influenced large-scale atmospheric circulation, disturbing recurring climate oscillations associated with alternating ocean and weather conditions. Under this interpretation, volcanic aerosols may have contributed indirectly to periods of prolonged drought affecting parts of the eastern Mediterranean during subsequent decades. Evidence supporting this possibility continues to be evaluated, and no universal agreement has emerged regarding the strength or duration of such effects. The growing picture, therefore, resists simple explanation. Geological evidence confirms the eruption. Archaeology demonstrates survival, followed by gradual decline. Environmental research suggests that changing climate may have increased existing pressures, while historical evidence reveals eventual Mycenaean dominance across Crete. Each line of investigation illuminates one part of a larger process without fully accounting for every development. Many scholars now favor a multi-causal interpretation. The eruption delivered a severe blow to an exceptionally interconnected civilization. Recovery proved possible, though incomplete. Environmental stress may have steadily reduced resilience, while political competition eventually altered the balance of power within the Aegean. No single event, however dramatic, appears sufficient to explain the entire story. The volcano reshaped the course of Minoan history, though the civilization's final transformation unfolded through the combined weight of many forces acting across generations. The story preserved beneath Santorini is far from complete. Every excavation season adds another small piece to a landscape that has remained protected beneath volcanic deposits for more than 3,000 years. Archaeology often advances through patience instead of dramatic discoveries, revealing forgotten worlds one careful layer at a time. In the case of Akrotiri, the greatest discoveries may still rest beneath ground that no excavation has yet reached. Systematic excavation at Akrotiri began during 1967 and has continued across the decades with remarkable care. Even after many years of work, the exposed streets and buildings represent only a small portion of the original settlement. Current estimates suggest that the visible excavation encompasses perhaps 3 to 5% of the city's full extent. Most of Bronze Age Akrotiri, therefore, remains concealed beneath thick deposits of hardened pumice and volcanic ash, waiting for future generations of archaeologists to continue the work. That buried landscape almost certainly contains additional homes, workshops, storerooms, painted walls, and public spaces. Each newly uncovered building expands understanding of daily life before the eruption, revealing details impossible to predict in advance. Storage vessels may still contain preserved organic remains, Wall paintings may survive within rooms that have remained sealed since the Bronze Age. Administrative records may still rest where they were originally placed, untouched by weather or later human activity because the volcanic deposits shielded them for millennia. Among the most anticipated discoveries are additional clay tablets. If future excavations recover substantial collections of Linear A inscriptions comparable to those found elsewhere on Crete, scholars would gain a much larger body of evidence for studying the undeciphered script. Greater numbers of texts would provide more repeated words, additional grammatical patterns, and wider opportunities for comparison. Although quantity alone cannot unlock an unknown language, every new inscription strengthens the possibility that one overlooked pattern may eventually reveal itself. The question of chronology also continues to evolve. Radiocarbon analysis becomes increasingly refined as laboratories improve calibration methods and expand reference datasets. Ice core research continues to compare volcanic sulfate layers preserved within polar ice, while dendrochronology studies annual growth rings preserved in long-lived trees. Together, these independent approaches gradually narrow the possible window for the eruption. Many researchers believe that a calendar year, accepted by broad scientific consensus, may eventually be established, providing a firmer foundation for the chronology of the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. Exploration extends below the surrounding waters as well. Detailed mapping has revealed much of the caldera floor, though only limited archaeological investigation has taken place beneath accumulated marine sediments. Geological evidence indicates that portions of the prehistoric landscape collapsed into the flooded basin during formation of the caldera. Structures associated with Bronze Age settlements may therefore remain buried beneath layers of sediment on the seafloor, preserved in places that have never undergone systematic excavation. Another enduring mystery concerns the people themselves. No major Minoan cemetery has been identified at Akrotiri, despite decades of research. The location of their burial grounds remains unknown, leaving important questions about funerary customs unanswered. Archaeologists also continue searching for evidence, tracing where survivors established new lives after abandoning the settlement before the eruption. The hope of finding a key to Linear A remains equally compelling. A bilingual inscription could appear within an unexplored archive, an Egyptian diplomatic record, or another context still hidden beneath the volcanic deposits. Each excavation, therefore, carries the possibility that a single discovery may illuminate questions that have endured since the Bronze Age, reminding us that the Earth has not yet finished telling the story of Akrotiri. Every day, ferries, cruise ships, and aircraft deliver new arrivals to Santorini, each drawn by scenery that appears almost impossibly graceful. During 2023, approximately 3.4 million visitors came to the island, walking along cliffside paths, watching sunsets above the caldera, and looking across blue water from terraces suspended high above the sea. The landscape celebrated in photographs around the world exists because of the eruption that reshaped the island more than 3,000 years ago. Modern tourism unfolds upon the lasting architecture of an ancient geological event. The cliffs surrounding the caldera preserve that history in plain view. Distinct bands of volcanic material extend across their faces, each representing a different episode in the island's long development. Among the most recognizable is the broad pale layer of pumice produced during the Minoan eruption. From passing boats, those bright deposits remain visible across wide stretches of the caldera wall. Geologists read the exposed sequence much as historians examine written documents, following each layer to reconstruct episodes separated by thousands of years. Near the center of the flooded basin rises Nia Kameni, a dark volcanic island that did not exist before the collapse of the ancient volcano. It began forming roughly 3,400 years ago as fresh magma repeatedly reached the surface, gradually building new land above the water. Each eruption added another layer of hardened lava, enlarging the island little by little. Its rugged appearance contrasts with the older cliffs surrounding it, providing visible evidence that volcanic construction continued long after the Great Bronze Age eruption had ended. Because the volcanic system remains active, Santorini is observed continuously by scientists. The National Observatory of Athens works together with international research teams using networks of seismometers, global positioning instruments, satellite observations, gas monitoring equipment, and other specialized tools. These systems measure subtle changes in ground movement, earthquake activity, volcanic gases, and surface deformation. Most variations reflect the ordinary behavior of an active volcanic environment, yet every measurement contributes to a clearer understanding of how the system changes through time. That careful monitoring proved especially valuable during late January of 2025. Thousands of earthquakes occurred across several weeks, creating the largest seismic crisis experienced in the region for many decades. Authorities ordered temporary evacuations for parts of Santorini and several nearby islands, while scientists examined the evolving sequence. Detailed analysis indicated that the activity most likely resulted from movement along underwater fault systems instead of magma rising toward the surface. Even after the earthquake swarm gradually diminished, the event demonstrated the importance of maintaining constant scientific observation. The episode also reinforced a broader reality. Santorini continues to display hydrothermal activity, gradual ground deformation, and recurring seismic events that reflect an active geological system. None of these processes alone signals an imminent eruption, yet together they reveal that the volcano remains part of Earth's continuing evolution. The island is neither frozen in the Bronze Age nor preserved as a finished landscape. Geological change continues, usually at a pace measured through careful instruments instead of dramatic spectacle. For volcanologists and emergency planners throughout Greece, the central challenge is therefore practical rather than philosophical. Another eruption will occur someday, although no one can predict when. The essential task lies in recognizing the earliest meaningful signs, distinguishing ordinary geological unrest from genuine precursors, and providing communities with sufficient warning should conditions begin to change. Santorini remains one of the world's most carefully studied volcanoes, where every new observation deepens understanding of a landscape that continues to write its own history beneath the familiar horizon. A single year can become a bridge between entire civilizations. When archaeologists uncover the remains of different cultures, each region often preserves its own sequence of rulers, settlements, artifacts, and natural events. Those timelines usually develop independently, connected only through occasional trade goods or historical references. The eruption of Thera occupies an unusual position because evidence of the same volcanic event appears across much of the eastern Mediterranean, offering the possibility of linking separate histories to one shared moment in time. Volcanic ash from the eruption has been identified within geological layers far beyond Santorini itself. These deposits serve as chronological markers because every layer of ash originated from one extraordinary eruption. When that distinctive material appears within an archaeological sequence, it provides an opportunity to compare events occurring in different places. Geologists refer to this process as synchronization, using one well identified natural event to align records that were previously organized according to separate local chronologies. The importance of that alignment reaches far beyond the Minoan world. If the eruption occurred around 1600 before the Common Era, then archaeological layers associated with Egypt, Crete, the Levant, Cyprus, Anatolia, and mainland Greece can be positioned relative to one another in a particular arrangement. Should the eruption instead belong closer to 1500 before the Common Era, every connected sequence shifts by approximately 1 century. That difference influences the dating of trade networks, diplomatic contacts, technological developments, and political transitions throughout the Bronze Age, Eastern Mediterranean. Many historical frameworks, therefore, depend upon resolving this question with greater precision. Egyptian dynastic chronology intersects with imported Minoan objects and foreign diplomatic exchanges. Records from the Hittite kingdom in Anatolia overlap with neighboring societies connected through commerce and warfare. The rise of Mycenaean influence across the Aegean must be understood within the same broader sequence. Bronze production on Cyprus, commercial centers along the Levantine coast, and chronological frameworks later associated with the historical setting of the Hebrew Bible all become easier to compare when anchored to a securely dated volcanic event. Scientific methods continue to refine that anchor. During 2022, researchers published an important radiocarbon study using the INTCAL-20 calibration curve, one of the most advanced tools available for interpreting radiocarbon measurements. Their analysis placed the eruption within a range extending from 1606 to 1589 before the Common Era, representing the most precise radiocarbon estimate yet achieved. Although this result does not end the discussion, it narrows the window considerably and provides a stronger foundation for comparison with other independent dating techniques. Even greater confidence would emerge if several forms of evidence converged upon exactly the same conclusion. Researchers continue searching for volcanic particles carrying the distinctive chemical signature of Thera within precisely dated polar ice layers. A confirmed match between radiocarbon evidence, ice core chronology, and geochemical identification would establish a common reference point accepted across multiple scientific disciplines. Such agreement would likely require systematic revision of Bronze Age chronology spanning numerous civilizations connected through trade and diplomacy. For that reason, laboratories, excavation teams, and geological surveys continue adding new pieces to the puzzle every year. Improved radiocarbon measurements, additional ice core studies, and newly identified volcanic deposits steadily refine the picture. Progress often arrives through small advances rather than dramatic announcements. Yet each carefully tested result brings the ancient Mediterranean closer to sharing one synchronized timeline, where the memory of a single eruption helps organize centuries of human history into a clearer and more coherent whole. Some civilizations leave behind libraries, others leave monuments, royal chronicles, and letters exchanged across distant kingdoms. The Minoans left something different. They left buildings shaped by careful hands, painted walls filled with movement, finely crafted pottery, engineered waterways, and thousands of small traces of ordinary life. Their voices, however, remain beyond reach. Across more than 3,000 years, their words have endured only as signs, impressed into clay, preserved but unread. Every discovery recovered from Crete and Akrotiri adds another fragment to their story, yet every fragment also reveals a boundary. Archaeologists can measure the dimensions of a palace room, identify grains stored inside a vessel, examine pigments used in a fresco, and reconstruct diets from animal bones or fish remains. They can follow streets, drainage channels, workshops, shrines, and storerooms with remarkable precision. These material remains describe how people lived, worked, traded, and built their communities. They cannot reveal what those people said to one another at the end of an ordinary day. One painted figure captures that absence with unusual clarity. The fisherman fresco from Akrotiri portrays a young man carrying strings of freshly caught fish, his posture natural and familiar despite the passing of millennia. The scene feels immediate because similar gestures can still be observed in fishing communities today, yet everything surrounding that familiar movement has vanished from memory. His name has disappeared. The words he spoke while greeting neighbors have disappeared. The name he gave the sea, the blessings offered before setting out, and the gratitude expressed after returning with a successful catch all remain beyond recovery. The greatest barrier lies within Linear A. Hundreds of inscriptions survive, carefully impressed by Minoan scribes who undoubtedly expected their records to be read by others. Those tablets may contain inventories, religious observances, legal agreements, administrative accounts, or details of everyday commerce. Somewhere among them may rest songs, prayers, or names remembered by families for generations. Without understanding the language beneath the script, every inscription remains a pattern whose meaning cannot yet be restored. There is also the possibility that the language itself no longer survives in any recognizable form. Many undeciphered writing systems eventually yield their secrets because related languages provide useful comparisons. The Minoan language may offer no such assistance. If no surviving linguistic relatives exist, and if no bilingual inscription is ever discovered, then the spoken world of Bronze Age Crete may remain permanently inaccessible. Their script would endure as visible writing whose sound and meaning have faded together. The Minoans are not alone in this condition. Across the ancient world, numerous scripts continue to resist decipherment, and many languages survive only through inscriptions that cannot yet be understood. Their case, nevertheless, carries unusual significance. They represent the earliest known civilization of Europe, influencing trade, architecture, craftsmanship, and cultural traditions that later societies inherited in transformed ways. Their achievements became part of a wider historical foundation, even as their own language slipped beyond memory. That contrast gives their legacy a distinctive character. We know the proportions of their buildings, the routes of their merchants, the foods prepared in their kitchens, and the tools held by their artisans. We can recognize the elegance of their craftsmanship and the confidence of their engineering. Yet the civilization that helped shape the beginning of Europe's recorded story continues to address the present through objects instead of sentences, leaving its most human thoughts suspended within words that still wait to be heard. Looking back across the centuries, the eruption of Thera appears less like the end of a story than the turning of a page. The Bronze Age continued long after ash settled across the Aegean. Cities remained occupied, merchants crossed familiar sea routes, and new kingdoms gathered influence. The Minoan world faded, yet the currents it had set in motion continued flowing through those who followed, carrying ideas, skills, and traditions into a different age. The Mycenaeans gradually became the dominant power across much of the region. Their society inherited maritime connections that had already linked distant shores for generations. Architectural knowledge, artistic influences, commercial practices, and stories transformed through retelling all passed from one culture into another. Later Greek civilization emerged from foundations shaped by many predecessors, including the people whose own language now lies beyond understanding. Cultural inheritance rarely follows a straight path. It travels through adaptation, memory, and continual change. The eruption, therefore, illustrates something broader than volcanic destruction. Every highly organized civilization depends upon relationships among people, landscapes, resources, and trade. Those connections generate prosperity during stable times, yet they also create pathways through which disruption can spread. When one essential part of the system fails, the effects rarely remain isolated. Recovery depends upon whether institutions, communities, and economies can adjust before mounting pressures become too great to overcome. For the Minoans, maritime exchange formed the heart of that interconnected world. Harbors connected settlements with distant partners. Agricultural abundance supplied palace economies. Specialized craftsmanship relied upon materials arriving from overseas. Each successful season reinforced the next, creating remarkable prosperity across the island. Those same strengths, however, also produced dependence. When transportation faltered, harvests declined, and political conditions shifted across succeeding generations, resilience gradually weakened. The civilization adapted for a time, though the accumulated pressures eventually exceeded its ability to recover fully. The eruption is sometimes described as the event that ended the Bronze Age. The archaeological record tells a different story. Nearly 400 years separated the catastrophe at Thera from the wider collapse that transformed societies across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 before the Common Era. Even so, the eruption disturbed an earlier balance that had supported Minoan influence. The region continued changing afterward, and stability proved increasingly difficult to sustain as new challenges emerged across succeeding centuries. Today, Akrotiri rests beneath a protective bioclimatic roof designed to preserve what volcanic deposits concealed for more than 3,000 years. Visitors walk along elevated pathways suspended above streets once traveled by merchants, craftspeople, families, and children. Rooms remain furnished with the outlines of everyday life. Staircases still rise toward vanished upper floors. Storage jars stand where they were placed long ago. The people departed before disaster arrived, leaving their city waiting beneath layers that became an unexpected guardian instead of complete destruction. That final irony endures. The same eruption that shattered one civilization also preserved its most complete urban settlement. Ash protected painted walls, household objects, workshops, and neighborhoods with extraordinary fidelity. Without the volcano, many of those details would almost certainly have disappeared through weather, rebuilding, or later occupation. Geological violence became an accidental archive, allowing distant generations to encounter lives that would otherwise have faded almost entirely from memory. What survives is more than evidence of catastrophe. It is evidence of ordinary human effort expressed through craftsmanship, planning, cooperation, curiosity, and imagination. Although the Minoans no longer speak in words we can understand, their cities continue to describe who they were. Across every uncovered street and carefully restored wall, they remind us that civilizations are measured not only by how they end, but also by the lives they create while they endure, and by the traces they leave for those who patiently learn to listen through stone, color, and earth.